The easiest person to underestimate is often the one with nothing left to prove. The words lingered in the air only seconds before the first crystal glass shattered the silence with a sharp clink against polished marble. Every conversation inside Sinclair House seemed to pause at once. Beneath towering chandeliers that bathed the elegant dining room in warm golden light, guests slowly turned toward the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice. Victoria Sinclair, the billionaire chief executive officer whose luxury hospitality empire stretched across the country, stood beside a corner table with perfect posture and an expression that rarely welcomed disagreement. Her tailored navy suit looked as flawless as the reputation she had spent 2 decades building. Across from her stood Ethan Brooks, a 39-year-old waiter whose neatly pressed white shirt, black apron, and polished shoes revealed a man who respected his work, even if the world rarely noticed him. He held a silver serving tray with steady hands while maintaining calm eye contact that neither challenged nor surrendered. Victoria's voice remained cool enough to silence an entire room. Do you always confuse confidence with competence? Several executives seated nearby exchanged amused smiles. One quietly laughed before lifting a glass of sparkling water. Another leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "This should be interesting." Ethan gently placed the tray onto a nearby service station before answering. "No, ma'am." Victoria folded her arms. "Then perhaps you should learn when to stay silent." Ethan's expression never changed. Respectfully, staying silent and losing your dignity are not the same thing. The sentence was delivered without anger, without sarcasm, and without raising his voice. Somehow that made it impossible to ignore. The laughter disappeared almost immediately. Forks rested against fine china. A pianist near the entrance allowed the final note of a jazz melody to fade naturally into the stillness. Nobody spoke. Warm candlelight reflected across polished wine glasses while the scent of fresh rosemary, butter, and baked bread drifted quietly through the restaurant. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Victoria studied him carefully. She had spent years negotiating billion-dollar contracts with powerful investors who rarely dared disagree with her. Yet this ordinary waiter refused to appear intimidated. He did not argue. He did not apologize. He simply stood with a quiet confidence that seemed entirely disconnected from his position. "Do you know who you are speaking to?" she finally asked. Ethan nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. And that does not concern you?" she continued. He answered with the same measured calm. "Titles deserve respect. People deserve dignity." A visible ripple moved through the dining room. Several guests lowered their eyes. A young hostess, standing near the entrance, instinctively held her breath. Even the restaurant manager hesitated before taking another step. Victoria slowly walked closer until only a few feet separated them. Her expensive heels echoed softly against the hardwood floor, each step measured, controlled, deliberate. "You are remarkably confident for someone wearing an apron," she observed. Ethan offered the smallest smile. "The apron tells you where I work. It does not tell you who I am." No one laughed this time. Every face remained fixed on the quiet exchange unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Somewhere inside the open kitchen, a timer chimed before falling silent again. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath the fading evening sun, completely unaware that inside one elegant restaurant, 2 lives had just collided. Victoria looked at the waiter one last time before turning toward the general manager. "I want every employee present tomorrow morning," she said evenly. "There will be a full operational review." Without another word, she walked toward the private dining corridor, leaving behind an entire room that remained frozen long after she disappeared. Ethan quietly picked up his serving tray, straightened a folded linen napkin left slightly out of place, and returned to serving guests exactly as if nothing unusual had happened. But every person who had witnessed the exchange understood one thing with absolute certainty. The story they thought they had just watched was only beginning. The restaurant did not finally empty until nearly 10 o'clock that evening. Yet the uneasy silence from the confrontation still seemed to linger beneath the chandeliers long after the last guest had gone home. Chairs were carefully pushed beneath polished tables. Candles were extinguished one by one, and the lingering aroma of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and warm bread slowly faded into the quiet kitchen. Ethan Brooks folded his black apron with the same care he gave every task, placed it neatly inside his locker, and wished every coworker a safe trip home before stepping into the cool Chicago night. No one mentioned what had happened earlier. They only looked at him with quiet curiosity, as though they had suddenly realized they knew almost nothing about the man who had worked beside them for more than a year. Ethan climbed into his aging pickup truck, the engine rumbling with familiar determination before carrying him through streets glowing beneath rows of amber streetlights. 25 minutes later, he pulled into a peaceful neighborhood where modest townhouses lined quiet sidewalks shaded by old maple trees. The porch light was already on. It always was. His 11-year-old daughter insisted that every father deserved to see one light waiting for him at the end of a long day. Ethan unlocked the front door as softly as possible. The house welcomed him with the comforting scent of cinnamon, fresh laundry, and the faint sweetness of pancake batter resting in the refrigerator for tomorrow morning. Children's drawings covered one side of the kitchen wall beside family photographs that captured birthdays, school concerts, and ordinary afternoons that somehow felt more valuable than any expensive vacation. Upstairs, a bedroom door remained slightly open. Ethan peeked inside and smiled. Lily had fallen asleep with an open library book resting across her blanket, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked safely beneath one arm. A small night light painted gentle stars across the ceiling while slow rain tapped softly against the bedroom window. Ethan carefully lifted the book onto the nightstand before pulling the blanket over her shoulders. As he turned to leave, he noticed a folded note lying beside the lamp. In careful handwriting she had written, "Please do not forget pancakes tomorrow. Emma still says yours are the best." Ethan quietly laughed to himself before slipping the note into his shirt pocket as though it were something priceless. Downstairs, he washed the few dishes left in the sink, prepared fresh strawberries for breakfast, and packed Lily's lunch before finally sitting at the kitchen table with a warm cup of coffee. His phone vibrated once against the wooden surface. A company notification appeared across the screen. Mandatory staff meeting. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Attendance required. Executive review led by Victorious Sinclair. Ethan stared at the message for several seconds before calmly locking the screen again. He did not sigh. He did not complain. Instead, he finished preparing tomorrow's breakfast exactly as planned, wiped the kitchen counters until they shined, and set 2 plates beside the stove. Outside, the rain grew steadier while the quiet neighborhood settled into peaceful sleep. Upstairs, Lily dreamed without the slightest idea that her father had become the center of attention inside one of the country's most prestigious restaurants. Ethan looked toward the staircase and smiled gently. Whatever happened tomorrow, one promise mattered more than every title, every paycheck, or every opinion waiting for him at work. Saturday morning would still begin with pancakes, because some promises were too important to break, and the people who loved him most had never once asked whether he wore an apron or a suit. Saturday morning arrived beneath a clear Chicago sky, painted with soft shades of blue and gold. The scent of fresh pancakes drifted through Ethan Brooks's modest kitchen, while Lily happily arranged sliced strawberries across her plate with the careful concentration only children seemed to possess. She looked up with a smile bright enough to erase every difficult memory from the previous evening. "You remembered," she said proudly. Ethan flipped one final pancake before placing it onto her plate. "Some promises are too important to forget." Lily laughed as she poured maple syrup into the shape of a smiling face. For nearly an hour, the outside world disappeared. There were no luxury restaurants, no billion-dollar executives, and no uncomfortable conversations. There was only a father listening as his daughter excitedly described a science project, a library book about astronauts, and a stray cat that had somehow become famous at school. When breakfast ended, Ethan drove Lily to her friend Emma's house, promising to pick her up before dinner. As she climbed out of the truck, she leaned back through the open passenger window and smiled. "Do not let anybody make you sad today." Ethan smiled in return. I will try my best. She nodded with complete confidence. You always do. Those simple words stayed with him during the entire drive back into downtown Chicago. Sinclair House stood exactly as it always had, elegant and imposing beneath the morning sunlight. Fresh flowers decorated the entrance. Delivery trucks unloaded premium ingredients through the rear service entrance. Employees quietly gathered inside with expressions somewhere between nervous anticipation and cautious curiosity. Everyone had received the same company message. Mandatory executive review. Nobody knew exactly what it meant. Ethan greeted the hostess by name before helping a young busboy carry several heavy boxes of sparkling mineral water into storage. He adjusted a slightly crooked painting in the hallway almost without thinking before walking toward the dining room. At precisely 8 o'clock, every employee stood beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers. Managers lined one side of the room. Servers stood shoulder to shoulder near the service station. Chefs quietly emerged from the kitchen. Even the dishwashing staff paused their work to attend the meeting. The atmosphere carried the stillness of a courtroom before an important decision. Then the main entrance opened. Victoria Sinclair entered without security, without assistance, and without unnecessary ceremony. Her charcoal business suit reflected quiet authority, while every measured step echoed softly across the polished hardwood floor. She surveyed the room slowly before speaking. Good morning. Her voice remained calm, controlled, impossible to ignore. People believe luxury begins with expensive furniture, fine ingredients, and elegant architecture. She paused, allowing every employee to focus completely. They are wrong. Luxury begins with discipline. Several managers nodded immediately. Victoria continued walking through the rows of employees until she stopped directly in front of Ethan. Their eyes met once again beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Mr. Brooks, she said evenly. Good morning, ma'am, Ethan replied. I assume you understand why we are here today. Ethan answered honestly. To improve the restaurant. A faint smile crossed Victoria's face before disappearing almost instantly. Interesting answer. She folded her hands behind her back. Most people would assume this meeting is about last night. Ethan remained perfectly composed. Yesterday is finished. Today's guests deserve today's best. Complete silence settled across the dining room. Even the ventilation system seemed louder than the people standing beneath it. Victoria studied him carefully. She had expected defensiveness. She had expected resentment. Instead, she found only quiet professionalism. She slowly turned toward the entire staff. Excellent, she announced. Then let us begin by discovering whether every employee here believes excellence is something they merely perform or something they choose to become. And without realizing it, everyone in the room had just stepped into a test far more personal than any of them expected. By the time the restaurant opened for lunch, every polished table had been inspected twice. Every crystal glass reflected the soft afternoon light, and every employee understood that Victoria Sinclair intended to notice even the smallest imperfection. Guests soon filled the elegant dining room with quiet conversations, the gentle sound of silverware against fine china, and the comforting aroma of fresh herbs, roasted vegetables, and warm artisan bread. Ethan Brooks moved through the room with practiced confidence, greeting every table with the same sincere smile regardless of whether the guests arrived in expensive designer suits or simple weekend clothes. He remembered children's names after hearing them only once, quietly replaced a guest's coffee before it became cold, and noticed an elderly gentleman struggling to read the menu before gently offering a larger print version without making him feel embarrassed. None of those gestures appeared on any performance report, yet they transformed ordinary service into something people never forgot. Victoria observed everything from a discreet corner near the private dining room. Clipboard in hand, she recorded service times, staff interactions, and operational details with the precision that had built one of the nation's most respected hospitality companies. She watched Ethan longer than anyone else. Every movement seemed effortless. Every decision seemed thoughtful. It frustrated her more than she cared to admit. Finally, she stepped directly into his section and quietly sat at an empty table prepared for future reservations. Nearby servers immediately sensed what was happening. Conversations softened. The restaurant manager instinctively moved closer without interfering. Ethan approached exactly as he would approach every other guest. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I offer you sparkling water or still water?" Victoria looked up without opening the menu. "Neither." Ethan nodded politely. "Then how may I assist you today?" She folded her hands neatly across the white tablecloth. "Yesterday you told me that dignity belongs to everyone." "Yes, ma'am. Even people who make your work more difficult, especially those people." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Ethan answered after only a brief pause. "Because respect offered only to kind people is not respect. It is convenience." A nearby executive quietly lowered his newspaper. Two guests stopped their conversation without realizing it. The pianist allowed the final note of a gentle melody to fade into silence. Victoria leaned forward just enough to make her next question personal. "Do you believe I treated you fairly?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, his attention shifted toward a young mother seated across the room, trying to comfort her restless little boy. Without asking permission, Ethan excused himself, walked calmly to the family, returned carrying a small bowl of fresh strawberries from the kitchen, and placed it gently in front of the smiling child. The boy's worried expression disappeared almost instantly. His grateful parents thanked Ethan with quiet relief. Only then did Ethan return to Victoria's table. "I apologize for the interruption," he said sincerely. Victoria studied him in silence. "You still have not answered my question." Ethan met her eyes with the same calm expression he had carried since their first conversation. "Fairness is important," he replied softly. "But kindness matters even more because kindness can exist even when fairness does not." The words settled gently across the dining room like falling snow. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Every employee simply continued working a little more quietly than before. Victoria looked around the restaurant, noticing something she had completely overlooked until that moment. Guests were not smiling because the dining room was expensive. They were smiling because one ordinary waiter made each of them feel seen. For the first time in many years, the billionaire chief executive officer found herself questioning whether she had spent too much of her life measuring excellence with numbers while overlooking the quiet humanity that could never appear on a spreadsheet. The lunch rush reached its busiest hour just after 1 o'clock, and Sinclair House hummed with effortless elegance. Sunlight filtered through towering windows, painting long golden reflections across polished hardwood floors, while crystal chandeliers shimmered above conversations that blended softly with the quiet melody of a grand piano. Every table was occupied. Every server moved with practiced precision. Victoria Sinclair remained near the center of the dining room, watching every detail with careful attention, yet her eyes continued returning to Ethan Brooks. He never appeared rushed. He never ignored one guest while serving another. Somehow he made every person believe they mattered. Then the front doors opened once again. An older gentleman entered wearing a simple charcoal sport coat, polished, brown shoes, and a warm smile that seemed untouched by wealth or status. The general manager immediately recognized him and walked forward. "Mr. Richard Holloway, welcome back." Several employees quietly exchanged surprised glances. Richard Holloway rarely visited without making headlines. One of the nation's most respected philanthropists, he had supported hospitals, schools, and community organizations for decades, yet he carried himself with remarkable humility. "Good afternoon," Richard replied warmly. "I hope I am not too late for lunch." Before the manager could answer, Richard's eyes wandered across the dining room until they landed on Ethan carrying a tray toward a nearby family. His expression instantly brightened. "Well," he said softly, almost laughing to himself, "there you are." Without hesitation, Richard crossed the dining room. Ethan looked up, recognized him immediately, and smiled. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holloway." Instead of offering a polite handshake, Richard reached forward with both hands. "It is wonderful to see you again, son." The nearby conversations gradually faded. Several guests looked up from their meals. Victoria watched the unexpected greeting with growing curiosity. Richard's voice carried naturally through the elegant room without ever becoming loud. "I have hoped our paths would cross again." Ethan answered modestly. "I'm glad you're doing well." Richard chuckled gently. "Doing well because of you." Confused expressions spread among the staff. Victoria quietly stepped closer without interrupting. Richard turned toward those nearby with the calm sincerity of a man simply telling the truth. "About 3 winters ago, I collapsed outside Union Station during a charity event. Hundreds of people walked by because they assumed someone else would stop." He looked toward Ethan with unmistakable gratitude. "This young man stayed beside me until the ambulance arrived. He called my daughter himself because I could barely speak. Then he quietly disappeared before anyone even knew his name." Ethan lowered his eyes slightly. "Anyone would have helped." Richard gently shook his head. "No, they did not." Complete silence settled over the dining room. Even the piano had stopped between songs. Richard continued with quiet admiration. "When my office finally located him several days later, we offered him a generous reward." Ethan smiled almost apologetically. "I could not accept it." Richard nodded. Instead, he asked whether we would donate those funds to the reading program at his daughter's public elementary school. Nobody spoke. Several employees looked toward Ethan with entirely different expressions than they had only minutes earlier. Victoria remained motionless. Richard placed one hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder. "Money can build beautiful buildings," he said softly, "but character builds beautiful lives." Ethan simply thanked him before excusing himself to refill an elderly couple's coffee without another word. He returned to work exactly as he always had, never mentioning the story again. Victoria watched him disappear between the tables, and for the first time since entering her own restaurant, she realized that the quiet waiter she believed she had already judged was still revealing pieces of a life she had never bothered to imagine. Ironically, the loudest revelation arrived inside complete silence. After Richard Holloway finished his lunch and quietly departed, the restaurant slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, but Victoria Sinclair no longer saw the dining room the way she had only an hour earlier. Guests continued smiling over elegant meals. Servers moved gracefully between polished tables, and Ethan Brooks carried another tray with the same steady confidence that had first irritated her. Yet now every ordinary gesture seemed to carry a meaning she had overlooked. When the afternoon service finally slowed, Victoria walked upstairs to her private executive office overlooking the restaurant through floor-to-ceiling glass. The city skyline stretched across the horizon beneath a pale autumn sky, while sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers onto her polished desk. She opened the employee management system on her computer, typed Ethan Brooks into the search bar, and expected to find a simple work history of an ordinary waiter. Instead, she found herself staring at a resume that immediately challenged every assumption she had made. Before joining Sinclair House, Ethan had spent more than a decade building a respected career in hospitality management. Assistant operations manager, guest experience director, regional service consultant, leadership certifications from nationally recognized hospitality institutes, outstanding performance reviews, recommendations written by executives whose names Victoria personally recognized. She quietly leaned closer to the screen. This was not the resume of a man who had settled for less. It was the resume of someone who had deliberately walked away from more. She continued reading until the timeline suddenly stopped 3 years earlier. There was no dramatic explanation, no emotional statement, only one simple sentence beneath his final position. Career paused to prioritize family responsibilities. Victoria remained still for several moments. The sentence felt strangely heavier than every award listed above it. She pressed the intercom button. "Megan, could you come in for a moment?" Her executive assistant entered carrying a digital tablet. "Yes, Miss Sinclair." Victoria looked toward the resume again. "Find out what happened after he left Hawthorne Grand Hotels." Less than 30 minutes later, Megan returned holding a thin personnel summary. "There was no scandal," she explained quietly. Former executives described him as one of the most respected leaders in the company. 3 years ago, his wife became seriously ill. He resigned several weeks later to care for her and for their daughter. After she passed away, he never returned to corporate management. Victoria slowly lowered the folder on her desk. Did anyone offer him another executive position? Megan nodded. Several companies did. According to his references, he declined because every position required extensive travel. He wanted to raise his daughter himself. Silence filled the office once again. Through the glass wall, Victoria watched Ethan below as he carefully wrapped a slice of cheesecake for an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. Before handing them the package, he quietly wrote congratulations on the container with a black marker and wished them many more happy years together. The couple smiled as though they had received something far more valuable than dessert. Ethan had already moved on to another table before they reached the front door. He never looked around to see whether anyone noticed. Victoria remained standing by the window long after the couple disappeared outside. For years, she had believed ambition demanded sacrifice. But now she found herself wondering whether Ethan had made the greater sacrifice by choosing love over prestige. His resume revealed impressive accomplishments. Richard Holloway had revealed extraordinary kindness. Yet neither explained the quiet peace that seemed to follow Ethan wherever he went. For the first time in her career, Victoria realized she was no longer trying to evaluate an employee. She was trying to understand a man whose greatest achievement had never appeared on any resume. Sunday afternoon arrived with cool autumn air drifting through Lincoln Park, where golden leaves floated gently across winding walking paths, and children filled the open fields with laughter that echoed beneath towering maple trees. For the first time all weekend, Ethan Brooks wore neither an apron nor a pressed white work shirt. Instead, he walked beside his 11-year-old daughter wearing a comfortable gray sweater, blue jeans, and worn brown boots that had seen many seasons. Lily skipped a few steps ahead before spinning around with a bright smile. "Race you to the bridge," she called. Ethan laughed softly. "You already know I cannot beat you." She grinned and ran anyway, her joyful laughter blending with the rustling leaves overhead. Ethan followed at an easy pace, never taking his eyes off her for long. Every few moments, she stopped to point at a squirrel climbing a tree, a family of ducks gliding across the pond, or clouds that looked like giant ships sailing across the sky. He listened to every observation as though it deserved the attention of the entire world. After reaching a small wooden bridge overlooking the water, Lily leaned against the railing and looked toward her father. "Can we feed the ducks?" she asked hopefully. Ethan smiled. "Only if we use the special bird food from the park stand. Bread is not good for them." Lily nodded immediately. Mom used to say that too. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze carried a few more leaves across the quiet water, while sunlight shimmered gently across the pond. Ethan rested one hand lightly on her shoulder. "She would be happy that you remembered." Lily smiled again, this time more gently. "I remember lots of things." They walked together to a nearby snack stand, where Ethan bought a small bag of bird feed and one vanilla ice cream with 2 spoons because Lily insisted sharing always made desserts taste better. Neither of them noticed that another familiar face had entered the park from a different path. Victoria Sinclair had come alone that afternoon after canceling 2 business meetings her assistant insisted could wait until Monday. She told herself she only wanted fresh air after an exhausting week. Yet when she noticed Ethan sitting on a weathered wooden bench beneath the maple trees, she instinctively slowed her pace. Hidden by the distance and the quiet crowd enjoying the weekend, she watched without intending to interrupt. There was no polished restaurant, no executive review, no tensión. Ethan listened patiently as Lily described a science project she hoped to finish before Thursday, carefully helping her spread bird feed near the pond before reminding her to leave enough for the smaller ducks standing farther away. When she accidentally dropped her spoon onto the grass, Ethan picked it up, wiped it clean with a napkin from his pocket, and handed it back with a smile that carried the same calm warmth Victoria had begun noticing inside the restaurant. Nothing about the afternoon seemed extraordinary, yet somehow every ordinary moment felt deeply meaningful. After finishing their ice cream, Lily quietly slipped her hand into her father's. "Thank you for always coming," she whispered. Ethan looked down at her with gentle eyes. "There is nowhere else I would rather be." Victoria remained motionless beneath the shade of another tree. She had spent years believing success meant being needed by thousands of employees, investors, and clients. Yet the quiet man she had once dismissed as only a waiter looked wealthier than anyone she had ever known because he possessed something no balance sheet could measure. He had kept the one promise that mattered most. As father and daughter slowly disappeared together beneath a canopy of brilliant autumn leaves, Victoria realized that genuine greatness was rarely announced. More often, it simply walked home holding the hand of someone who trusted it completely. Monday morning arrived wrapped in cool autumn sunlight that poured through the tall windows of Sinclair House, turning the polished hardwood floors into ribbons of warm gold. Employees gathered quietly before opening for breakfast service, each person sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Managers stood near the entrance with tablets in hand. Servers adjusted crisp uniforms. Chefs stepped briefly from the kitchen, and the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted gently through the elegant dining room. Ethan Brooks arrived a few minutes early as always. He greeted the dishwasher, helped the young hostess straighten several menus that had slipped from her hands, and quietly polished a fingerprint from a crystal water pitcher before taking his place near the service station. Nothing about his routine had changed. Victoria Sinclair entered exactly at 8 o'clock. She wore the same tailored navy suit that had become a symbol of confidence throughout her company, yet something in her expression had softened. The determination remained, but the distance had quietly disappeared. She stood before her employees for several long moments without speaking. The restaurant settled into complete silence. Even the gentle hum of the ventilation system seemed unusually loud. Finally, she looked directly toward Ethan. "Mr. Brooks," she said calmly, "would you please join me for a moment?" Ethan walked forward without hesitation, stopping several feet away with his usual quiet composure. Victoria drew a slow breath before turning toward the entire staff. "Last Friday," she began, "I believed I understood everything I needed to know about one of the people who worked inside this restaurant." She paused as dozens of employees listened without moving. "I believe titles revealed character. I believe success gave me the ability to judge people quickly. I was wrong. No one whispered. No one shifted their feet. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, while early sunlight rested across rows of perfectly prepared tables." Victoria faced Ethan once more. "I owe you an apology." The words echoed gently through the room. Several employees exchanged astonished glances. Ethan simply listened. Victoria continued with complete sincerity. "I judged your profession instead of your values. I questioned your confidence before understanding your sacrifice. I measured your position instead of your character. That was my failure, not yours." The silence grew even deeper. A young server slowly lowered the coffee pot she had been carrying. The restaurant manager quietly removed his glasses. Nobody had ever witnessed the billionaire chief executive officer speak with such humility. Ethan offered a gentle smile. "Thank you, ma'am." Victoria looked almost surprised by the simplicity of his answer. "That is all?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded once. "A sincere apology does not need punishment. It deserves grace." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The entire dining room seemed suspended in one unforgettable moment. Every eye remained fixed upon the quiet waiter and the woman who had finally chosen humility over pride. Then Victoria smiled for the first time without reservation. "There is one more thing," she said, turning back toward the staff. "Beginning today, every employee in this company deserves to be heard regardless of job title. Great ideas do not belong only to executives. Respect does not belong only to managers. From this day forward, our culture will reflect that truth." Gentle applause began near the kitchen before spreading naturally across the dining room. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The applause carried gratitude instead of celebration. Ethan remained exactly where he stood, accepting neither praise nor attention. He simply looked around the room and saw people smiling at one another in ways they had not only days before. In that quiet morning light, beneath the crystal chandeliers of the restaurant where everything had begun, victory belonged to no single person. It belonged to the simple decision that dignity would never again depend upon the title stitched onto someone's uniform. Several weeks passed, and the transformation inside Sinclair House became impossible to miss. Guests still admired the elegant dining room, the sparkling crystal chandeliers, and the carefully prepared cuisine, but they also noticed something far less visible. Servers greeted one another with genuine warmth. Managers paused long enough to thank the kitchen staff. New employees were encouraged to speak instead of remaining silent. Respect had quietly become part of the restaurant's atmosphere, woven into every greeting, every conversation, and every small act of kindness. Ethan Brooks continued arriving before sunrise on every shift, still wearing the same neatly pressed white shirt, the same polished shoes, and the same calm smile that had never depended upon recognition. Nothing about his routine suggested he had become the quiet example everyone now admired. One Friday afternoon, Victoria Sinclair invited him to her executive office overlooking the Chicago skyline. Warm sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, filling the room with a gentle golden glow. A single folder rested neatly in the center of her desk. She stood as Ethan entered instead of remaining behind her chair. "Thank you for coming," she said with genuine warmth. Ethan nodded politely. "Of course, ma'am." Victoria slid the folder toward him. "I would like to offer you the position of Director of Guest Experience for this flagship restaurant. I believe your leadership belongs wherever people can learn from it." Ethan opened the folder slowly, reading each page with careful attention instead of excitement. The salary was generous. The responsibilities reflected everything he had once done before choosing a different path in life. When he reached the final page, he quietly closed the folder and looked back at Victoria. "May I ask one question?" She smiled. "Anything." Ethan rested one hand gently on the folder. "Will I still be able to leave by 4 o'clock every Friday to pick up my daughter after school?" Victoria did not answer immediately. Instead, she smiled with the quiet understanding that only comes after someone has finally learned the lesson life intended to teach. "That schedule has already been written into the position," she replied. "Leadership should never require someone to break the promises that matter most." Ethan's expression softened with gratitude. "Then I would be honored to accept." Victoria extended her hand, but Ethan's handshake no longer represented a business agreement. It represented mutual respect earned through humility instead of authority. Later that afternoon, the employees gathered briefly before dinner service. No formal announcement had been planned, yet word had quietly spread throughout the restaurant. One by one, managers, chefs, servers, hosts, and dishwashers congratulated Ethan, not because he had received a promotion, but because they believed the right person had been chosen. Richard Holloway happened to be enjoying lunch that day. As Ethan passed his table, Richard simply lifted his coffee cup with a warm smile. Ethan returned the gesture before continuing toward the front entrance. Outside, his old pickup truck waited in its usual parking space beneath the fading afternoon sun. The engine still rumbled exactly as it always had. The driver's seat still carried the faint scent of coffee, library books, and maple syrup from countless Saturday mornings. Some things never needed to become expensive to become precious. A few minutes later, Ethan parked outside Lily's school just as students began pouring through the front doors. She spotted the familiar pickup immediately and ran toward him with the carefree joy only childhood could create. Climbing inside, she fastened her seatbelt before looking at him with a bright smile. "Did you have a good day?" Ethan glanced toward the glowing sunset stretching across the Chicago skyline before looking back at his daughter. "I had a very good day," he answered softly. Lily tilted her head with curious eyes. "Why?" Ethan started the engine and smiled the same quiet smile that had carried him through every challenge without bitterness or pride. "Because today reminded me that kindness is never wasted." Lily nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. Together they drove toward home while golden evening light settled gently across the road ahead, leaving behind a restaurant that had learned a simple truth no business school could ever teach. Titles may open doors, success may build remarkable buildings, but quiet dignity, faithful promises, and genuine kindness are the things people remember long after every other achievement has faded away.